What's up, YouTube? What's good? We are back on the channel today with another banger. My name is Supra, or TMG, and today we'll be going over a tier ranking of Kanye West's discography, specifically all of his albums. I know, this is a little different video compared to the usual album reviews that y'all have been expecting, but I think this should still be really fun. So without further ado, let's get into it. First things first, let's start off with Kanye's first album, The College Dropout. I think it's an incredible album. It's a great debut album. There's a lot of really amazing songs. The lyricism is definitely there. Kanye's trying his verses, as you can tell. His bars are great. And obviously, the production's going to be there because it's Kanye. So I think it goes in the A tier. And it's a great album, but he does have better albums. So I think that's a fair placement for The College Dropout. And next comes Late Registration. I think that also goes into A tier. It's like The College Dropout. It's a really great album. Many bangers. Very few, if any, misses. The production's great, lyricism great. And I personally would say Late Registration is a little better than College Dropout. But they're on the same tier, I'd say, of albums. And now we get to Graduation. This is definitely one of Kanye's best albums. I'd put in an S tier because it's in my top three for the best Kanye albums that he has. A lot of people have it as their number one, which is very reasonable, but I just think it's a little worse than the next two that I'll talk about. But it's still incredible, so it deserves to be S tier. Next is 808s and Heartbreak. It's also S tier. Like, come on. He essentially revolutionized the use of auto-tunes and 808s in a cohesive way. And you probably don't get artists like Travis, a little bit of Future, a little bit of Don Toliver without 808s and Heartbreak. It's just an amazing album. It was pivotal for the music game. So it was very influential in that way. And it's just a really good album as well, right? Like, you have a heartbroken Kanye that's really putting out good verses, really caring about what he says in his music. So I think it deserves to be S tier. I personally have this as my favorite Kanye album, and in my opinion, also the album that he's at his best at. So I'd say this is probably Kanye's best album, in my opinion. And a close second to that is My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. This album is a banger. So many classics on this album. Very few misses. I don't even think, no, there's no misses actually. Sorry. It's a really good album, cohesive, and it's probably the last time we really saw Kanye. Well, I guess not the last time, but the last solo album that we really saw Kanye rapping like crazy, you know? Like, last time we really saw like really good bars, really good lyricism. So it's definitely in the top three, and this is definitely the big three in my opinion for Kanye's best albums. So I think those three and these two, they make a lot of sense for where they are. And next we get into Watch the Throne. I'd say this is also A tier. It's a very, very good collaboration album between Jay-Z and Kanye. There's a lot of bangers, very few skips, if any. Great features from Frank Ocean, Beyonce, etc. Like, the album is amazing, and obviously you have really good massive hits in like Otis and in Paris, but I think it's just a little bit worse than these three. And I think it's just on the same tier as College Dropout and Late Registration. So I think A tier is very fair for Watch the Throne. Now we get into Yeezus. A lot of people love this album, and I've seen that. I have friends that say that. It's just, it doesn't connect as much for me. It's a good album for sure. There's a lot of really good songs. Obviously, Blood on the Leaves, New Slaves, Bound 2, but it's just a little more experimental than I would like. Kanye definitely tries something very different with the sound, and I appreciate that. It's just not as good as these three albums or even these three albums. So I think I'll say it's B tier. It's a very solid album. It's a good album, but it's just nothing compared to the six that are above it. So I think B tier is very solid and fair for Yeezus. Now we get to The Life of Pablo. This album on first listen was really solid, but it was just meh for me. Like it was a decent album on first listen, but after listening to it a couple more times, I really started enjoying it. So I think it's fair to put it in the B tier as well. I think it's on the same tier as Yeezus. It's definitely not as good as these three. So obviously it's not gonna be as good as these three. So I think it's fair to say it's around the same tier as Yeezus, and they're both kind of similar albums in that sense. Now we get to Yay. Now Yay was, it's not a bad album by any stretch, but it's also not elite. So I think that puts it around like C tier, which I think is fair because there's definitely a lot better albums from Kanye. All of these albums right here. There's also gonna be ones that are way worse. There's definitely some really fire songs. There's great features from like Party Next Door, etc. So it's not a bad album, but it's not anything like the ones that are above it. Now that sees us go to Kids See Ghosts. This album is amazing. It's one of Kanye's most underrated albums, in my opinion, and it's very short. I think it's only 7 songs, but it's amazing. No skips, and I personally think this is another A tier Kanye album. I honestly think Kids See Ghosts is comparable to Watch the Throne, and I think that may be a hot take, but the production is incredible. Kanye's lyricism is pretty damn good considering we won't see MBDTF Kanye ever again, probably. But the lyricism is great. Kid Cudi's amazing on the album. His vocals, his verses, and all the features are great. Pusha T was great on one of his features. So the album as a whole is amazing. So I think it's very worthy for it to be A tier. And now we get to Jesus is King. This is D tier. And I don't really think this needs much explanation. It's one of Kanye's worst albums. It might be his worst actually. But there's another album that comes close to that. We'll talk about later. It's not a great album by any stretch compared to his previous works. It's not the worst album you'll ever hear. There's a lot worse than Jesus is King. But it's definitely Kanye's worst, or bottom 2, I'd say. So it deserves to be D tier. Donda. Donda, I had a lot of hype for. It was promoted amazingly. The rollout was great. I really thought this was going to be another Kanye classic. But once I got to it, it just wasn't all that. It was a good album, but it wasn't elite by any stretch, right? I think something that hindered it was that there was just way too many songs on the album. If I remember properly, there's more than 20 plus songs on the album, and that includes like the deluxe as well, which he dropped a bunch of songs on. So I think it just got over bloated with the amount of songs, and as a result, it brought down the album quality by a lot. So I think if he had a more like cohesive project with like, I don't know, like 14 songs, 15 songs, it would have been a lot better. But it's still not bad. There's a couple of really, really fire songs. Some of Kanye's best rapping in a minute. Off the Grid was amazing. So Hurricane obviously was a classic. But I think overall it's probably just a C tier album. It wasn't as good as these albums that are above it. But it's definitely not as bad as Jesus is King. Right? Like that's a really bad album. But now we get on to Vultures 1. Vultures 1 is, in my opinion, Kanye's best album since The Life of Pablo. So I think it's very worthy to say it's B tier. It's, in my opinion, better than Ye, Donda, and Jesus is King. It honestly saw one of Kanye's best like productions since I'd say Life of Pablo. Like obviously like these albums had great production, but I liked Vultures 1's productions on the songs a lot more. And the lyricism obviously wasn't there for Kanye, right? Like at this point I've kind of accepted that Kanye's just not going to be an elite lyricist anymore. But it kind of sucked. But Ty's features on this album were great. His vocals, his verses, amazing. The actual features were great as well. You had some hits, you had some underrated songs. So the album was really good. So I think it's solid to say that it's in B tier. It's obviously nothing compared to like these 7 albums, but it's also not as bad as these bottom three. So I think B tier is very reasonable. And now we get to Vultures 2. This album was terrible. Yeah, I don't really know what to say for it. It was just so bad. There was a couple of really good songs, but even on the really good songs, Kanye's verses somehow ruined the vibe of the song, right? Like Field Trip and Promotion, Kanye's verse ruined the overall greatness of the song. 530, didn't even finish his last verse. Like it it's just Kanye got in the way of himself on this album, in my opinion. It could have been a really great album for sure, with better lyricism, finished verses, better production and mixing. Like it could have been a great album, but it wasn't, and it was kind of an unfinished product. And even if it was like finished with all the mixing and stuff, I still think it would be a terrible album. So it definitely goes in the D tier. Like I don't think there's much like controversy or like anything with that. It should be obvious that this is one of Kanye's worst albums, and in my opinion, might be tied with Jesus is King as his worst. It just wasn't there. Kanye essentially mailed in all his verses. He didn't care about his lyricism, and the project as a whole just seemed like he kind of gave up, with like making great albums. Like compare this to Vultures 1, and it's so much worse because at least in Vultures 1, even if he didn't have like the elite lyricism that he has on like Graduation, 808s, MBDTF, Watch the Throne, or any of these 7 albums, at least you could wait and see Ty Dolla $ign do his thing. You could see Kanye still put in his work in the production. The production was incredible on Vultures 1, but here the production wasn't even amazing. The mixing was bad, lyricism terrible. It's just the album as a whole is just very, very bad compared to his entire discography. So I'd say that's honestly reasonable. And I might even put in the F tier. Nah, I won't put it F tier. It's not that bad, but it's definitely not a good album compared to the rest of Kanye's discography. So to kind of recap, S tier is where I'd say I'd put Kanye's 3 best albums, not in any particular order, because personally, if I go by order, I'd say 808s and Heartbreak is his best, then MBDTF, then Graduation. But honestly, I think these 3 are probably Kanye's best works, and I don't think that's really like arguable, Next, we get into the A tier, where we have College Dropout, Late Registration, Watch the Throne, and Kids See Ghosts. And I think these 4 are amazing albums too, but they just don't reach the heights that you see on MBDTF, 808s, or Graduation. Then we get to the B tier. We have Yeezus, The Life of Pablo, and Vultures 1, which are still solid albums for sure, but again, they're not as good as these 7 that are above it. Now, the D tier, we have Ye and Donda, which aren't bad albums, but they're not great either. So I'd say they're like decent. So I think C tier fits that because it's like C tier is like average, right? So I'd say these are like average Kanye albums, And then D tier is where we get to the bad albums, or the bad Kanye albums, Jesus is King and Vultures 2 are definitely 2 of Kanye's worst albums ever. And I'd say it's pretty obvious that these are his worst albums ever, Like, there's nothing that compares these with all of these that are above it. So I think these are worthy of the D tier. That's all we have for today. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, or subscribe. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of my tier list. Do you think Yeezus or Jesus is King or Vultures 2 are too low? Do you think I'm too high on Kids See Ghosts, Watch the Throne, etc.? Just let me know what you guys think. What do you think Kanye's best albums are? And whatever it is, just leave your feedback. This is supposed to be an open community. We can bounce ideas off of one another. And again, music is subjective. So you might think that I'm very, very low on Jesus is King or like Vultures 2. But again, it's my opinion. You guys can have your opinions. And whatever it is, just put it down below. Anyways, enough of the rambling. Thanks for watching again. And until next time.